thank you very much to the organizers for the kind invitation to put me on the spot to moderate a session with an outstanding panel covering a huge swath of issues, pricing, trade, investment in just 40 minutes. What a challenge. Very few words just about me and my organization. So EDF stands for Environmental Defense Fund. Do not confuse it with the Électricité de France, quite different. We're an international environmental organization with offices in the United States, Europe, China, and India, and with a footprint of environmental projects around the world. I'm by profession, by career, has been for over 20 years now in climate policy, international climate policy, as a climate delegate for Portugal in the European Union, mostly working on carbon pricing issues and carbon markets. So some of you may recognize me from my clean development mechanism days back in 2010-11. So enough with my introductions. This session is going to be very much around an intriguing proposal that has been made in a paper led by Jayant Sinha here on a global climate alliance. So I'd really encourage you to read that paper if you haven't. And I would start exactly there with you, Mr. Sinha. Tell us about what is the proposal for a global climate alliance? Where does the idea come from? What is the concept? And how do you think it brings added value to a lot of initiatives and constellations around the world?
Thank you very much, Pedro. And once again, wonderful to be on this panel and to discuss this set of issues. So the notion of the Global Climate Alliance is really a mechanism by which capital and technologies from the global north can move to the global south. We know that if we look at greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, some 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions are going to come from the global south, not from the global north. And when I say the global south, I'm excluding China. So if we really have to bring the world back into balance, as Sri Singh said earlier, the world is on fire. If we have to douse the fire, then it really is important for the global south to decarbonize, to get to net zero. But right now, the global south has neither the capital nor the technologies to decarbonize fast enough. I will repeat that. The global south has neither the capital nor the technologies to bring down greenhouse gas emissions. So it's in all of our interests, the north and the south, to have a global climate alliance that will enable the flow of capital from the north, where there's plenty of capital and they have all the technologies, to the south. Now, India is at the vanguard of that. So we are benefiting from capital flows and technology flows. But when we think of the global south, we have to take into account what's happening in Indonesia, in South Africa, in Nigeria, in Brazil, all the countries of South America, and so on. So for all of these countries in the global south, if we don't provide them the support that they require at this stage for capital and technology flows, we are not going to bring the world back into balance. So this is a huge overriding priority, and we've got to find the systems, the mechanisms that will allow us to do that. Now, the second important point to recognize here, that most of the greenhouse gas emissions in the global south are coming from private sector entities. And most of the assets have yet to be built. So the steel plants of the future that are based on coking coal have to be replaced with green steel using green hydrogen instead. That's going to happen over the next 10, 20, 30 years. The coal plants, 4,000 megawatt coal plant coming up in my own constituency, will have to be replaced by round-the-clock solar 10, 20 years from now. How is that going to happen? We need to be able to support the private sector in moving towards green technologies, and that's point number 2. Point number 3 is that if we have to get these flows of capital from the global north to the global south, we need to be able to innovate at scale on a variety of blended finance instruments, which is not happening right now. And so the Global Climate Alliance will be focused on blended finance for the private sector. And this includes things like long-term currency swaps, it includes climate insurance, it includes guarantees, and it includes more risk capital, equity capital going into climate solutions in the global south. So the focus really has to be on blended finance instruments. And unless governments step in, particularly governments of the global north, step in to support the private sector of the global south, it's not going to happen. And so we've laid out a roadmap, we've laid out governance arrangements. It really revolves around agreed upon decarbonization pathways in various different sectors in the global south. For example, in grid stabilization, how do we stabilize grids to take renewables? Green steel, and on and on. So it's really around evolving these decarbonization pathways for certain sectors, supported with these blended finance instruments, so that we can work together to make this happen. And for that, we really need a global climate alliance. To conclude, I'm very happy that in the G20 declaration, we've talked about a green development pact. You heard Sri Singh talk about the triple agenda for MDB reform for blended finance. So parts of this agenda is already being implemented, already being discussed at the highest level. So I'm very pleased that we've been able to make good progress on this idea of a global climate alliance.
Well, thank you for laying that out, the concept so clearly. I'll turn to Mr. Yemi Osinbajo's son. You were former vice president of Nigeria. And I'd ask a provocative question. Listening to what you just heard, and being myself a climate negotiator, and having heard many times Global South delegates, including most prominently Indian delegates, ask for more consistent and more innovative climate finance at volume, at scale. How do you think that this proposal resonates with you and your own experience?
I think really this has perhaps the most excellent chance of working. First, because it addresses, the primary problem. We're recognizing first that for us in the global south, and I speak in particular about Africa, net zero is indeed net positive, and we're expected to grow along, what some have described as climate positive growth. And climate positive growth, of course, means that there must be substantial investment in renewable energy and all of the processes that will lead to greening, greening manufacturing and supply chain. Now, how do we arrive, or how do we get there? Institutional private capital is definitely the way to go. I mean, so today we spend a lot of time on what the MDBs are able to provide, which really, and if you look at the balance sheets of the MDBs, I mean, 1.5 trillion in all, whereas institutional private capital controls somewhere in the region of 200, 300 trillion US dollars. So really accessing institutional private capital is what we need in order to be able to achieve the ambitions we've set for ourselves. I think the Global Climate Alliance is sensitive, I mean, from what I've seen and read, sensitive to that key, actually being able to access institutional private capital. And if we're able to do that, then we can really talk about achieving some of the ambitions that we have. So for me, the exciting part of it is that there's a clear recognition that we must focus on trying to unlock private capital for purposes of climate positive growth in the global south.
Thank you. I cannot resist a bit of a provocation. At one point in my career, I put a proposal to the African Development Bank, together with some other experts, on what you call an innovative climate finance instrument, or carbon finance instrument. And what I could realize was that the institutional culture of some of the MDBs and the regional development banks is very risk averse to to an extent that was mind-boggling. The interesting thing is that that same concept was then picked up by the World Bank years later and managed to substantially leverage capital for what was basically risky CDM projects. So I think there's a lot to change in the culture of the bank, and I think that the Global Climate Alliance would go a long way in doing that. So I'll turn on to Jesse Scott, and the question to you would be: you've now heard the concept of the alliance, you've worked on the paper yourself. Moving away from just the issue of climate finance, how does the alliance fit in, let's say, regulating overall climate policy, just so going beyond finance, but other things related to trade in particular, where we're seeing increasing trade tension related to climate policy?
Thank you, Pedro, and thank you also to all the speakers earlier this morning. It's been a very, very interesting day. I think the question you asked picks up a theme from this morning, which has been finding new forms of cooperation that we haven't seen before. That was clear in the ambassador's speech. It was very clear from Mr. N.K. Singh. So to be helpful, a new entity in a quite busy climate landscape needs to deliver something specific, ultimately on technologies and finance. I don't think, let's say we are still working on the sectoral potential outcomes. We're still working on the finance flows. In the meantime, I think the space for a climate alliance approach to become a forum for discussions about some of the regulatory challenges, which are also very, very important, both between governments as an issue of tension, and of course for the private sector as they look at investment choices. So what do I mean by a forum for discussion on some of the regulatory challenges? Let's talk about the unintended consequences of good policies. There are good policies being developed in India, there are good policies being developed in Europe, where I'm from, in the US, and worldwide. But some of these have unintended consequences when it comes to the multilateral and the bilateral level. And I'm sure everybody in this audience will be thinking carbon markets, carbon borders, clean tech support. I think these topics will come up from the other panelists. That is an area where we need to avoid misalignment. Now, we're not talking about total alignment of policies. There are very good reasons for policy diversity, but misalignments that become barriers is a growing problem. One recommendation, if I may, coming from the European debate: very helpful to have these conversations about alliances and clubs with European countries, but the EU is, of course, also a joint actor as the European Union. And there, really, the most powerful conversation you can have with the European Union is trade. There is the relaunch of the EU-India trade negotiations, at least called for from the European side, and I'd like to hear a lot more from the Indian side about expectations for that. There's also, I hope, an EU-India summit to be scheduled in December. To the best of my knowledge, a date for that has not yet been fixed. So it's helpful to talk to European countries, but there's clearly also a Delhi-Brussels conversation that I would like to enrich in this space to avoid misalignments that are unintended, that are becoming part of the long list of barriers that we're looking at. Thank you, Pedro.
Thank you, Jesse. Now, I'll turn over to Mahua, who's a known entity here in India, with a past in development of, let's say, initiatives such as the electrification of buses at the national level. And as we are collectively embarking in India, embarking on an energy transition, what, from your viewpoint, would be the value added to Indian, well, business, but to Indian initiative of an alliance. So what do India's need in terms of, we've heard about capital from such an alliance?
Thank you, Pedro. Thank you for that. It's a very long answer, as you can imagine. We've got every sort of problem and every sort of solution for every problem. But let me just say, maybe I'll break it into three for now. If there were such an alliance / climate club, I would say for one, let's make it, it would have to become sector-based. Yeah, because the risks inside a certain sector, of course, very different from some other sectors. Let me put some flesh into that. Just until some months ago, I was building out this electric bus program. We ran the first tender. It was about $1 billion in one tender. And then we ran a second one. It was even more than $1 billion in the second tender. And then we ran a third one, and it was not as successful because we couldn't find, the market was not willing to take the risk of the counterpart. I feel I've gone hoarse over the years talking about credit guarantees and instruments and all these financial ways to fix risk that is sitting inside a particular sector. Those risks have to be fixed now. And I fully understand that perhaps hydrogen is better and perhaps fuel cells are better. But the fact is today, we have a solution, it works, we have a desperate need, and we have finally a model in our system and in our discourse that's willing to work at scale. Now, at scale is really important because otherwise it's really, there's a part of me that says we don't have the time, we can't afford the time lost. So much as I don't like to think sectors because it goes into very traditionalistic siloed thinking, these risks, when you break it down to financing that is needed, have to, of course, fit today's reality. So that's number one. In the energy transition space, again, because we don't have time, we've got to do this quickly. Now, of course, we've got to do this quickly. It seems quite, quite staid to say that. But what I actually mean by that is, I find here that we've got to do quickly by touching the lives of people, of lots and lots of people. And Jayant and I were at an event over the weekend where I saw for me, it was my first time. I don't come from digital. But the power of being able to use digital to get to every individual. Let me go back to the bus business. The reason we picked electric buses for the state run is because it affects just consumers for whom tickets will always have to be subsidized. Public transportation is a subsidized matter. Now, I want to be able to always reach them, and perhaps digital is the way to do it. Once you get technology, once you get people on board, you achieve speed automatically. One doesn't kind of realize that through that, the groundswell creates that sort of speed. And the third piece I'll put out there, because we have, Pedro and I go back a long time into this carbon markets business. I was one of the first few that was playing around with this idea about maybe 25 years ago. In the first 15 years of our carbon markets journey, where India was involved, the carbon business was a small little piece of very important money, but it was not part of the structure of a project, of the finance. We made a lot of mistakes. We tried a lot of things, as you know very well. We ran into lots of risks, but we now have a point in our history where we've got this opportunity to make a concerted effort at putting that little portion of externality, which we have finally monetized. We've even discovered how much it will cost to make battery storage viable. Renewable powered battery storage can become viable at a certain price, which can be discovered through interesting financial instruments. But we've got to think about it from the beginning. So whichever way we look at it, all these instruments have to come together at the start of an investment into a sector and not in bits and pieces, because you're always then designing suboptimally, always designing suboptimally. So I'd put these three things for now.
Thank you. And as somebody who's been around the design of carbon markets, I feel like we were always learning from mistakes. and improving. But there's certainly, if there's one thing I know about carbon markets, there's no single perfect carbon market. And as a European, I'm a little bit off the beaten track. Most Europeans would tell you that the EU ETS is excellent and should be copied. And on that note, also, I know you as somebody who has been advising many governments, especially here in this region, on the development of carbon markets, Korea, China, also India now. What, in your view, would be the role of something like the Climate Alliance in fostering, is it coordination? Is it sharing of experiences? What can be done collectively rather than just individually by nation?
Thank you very much, Pedro. And yeah, thank you for the question. So I think the Global Climate Alliance can serve a very useful purpose because both Global North and Global South are facing significant challenges in realizing the opportunities of carbon pricing. So what I'd like to talk about, also in the context of CBAM, because this discussion relates to trade as well, is how there can be a solution to reduce risks of CBAM, to enable achievement of NDC targets in a cost-effective way, and to achieve more, I guess, harmonization across countries. And I think there's two priority issues. One is embedded carbon of production, so the carbon content of steel, cement, etc. Number two is the carbon price. And I think the Global Climate Alliance can do some very useful work in both of these topics. The first one I'd like to talk about is reducing the embedded carbon. So as you know, the carbon price works in two ways. The carbon price itself is a motivator for investment and operation decisions for low carbon solutions, but very importantly, it can generate finance. It can generate huge amounts of auction revenue. Now, this is a very exciting time, particularly in India, with the Indian carbon market expected to be launched very soon for the first 4 sectors, including iron and steel. This will build on the PAT scheme that you're no doubt very familiar with. So India has a very good starting point for its carbon market. You're also probably familiar that China has been running a carbon market since 2021, Korea since 2015, Indonesia started a carbon market. I'm talking about compliance market, not voluntary market. Indonesia started one this year for the power sector. Outside Asia, we have Mexico, Brazil, the EU clearly, and UK. And I think very interestingly, Japan. So last week we were in Tokyo, and Japan is also now developing its carbon market, its emissions trading system. So this year they start a voluntary system. By 2026, it will be a full-scale system. And the interesting thing about the Japan design is that they're trying to encourage upfront payment to help industry decarbonize. And they're planning to generate $135 billion of money through a Japan climate transition bond. This is part of $1 trillion of money that Japan thinks it needs to transform its power and energy-intensive industry. This bond is going to be paid off by auction revenue for power companies in Japan. So one of the challenges here is that if you look at, say, China, it has not yet integrated its ETS with the power market. Indonesia is facing some trouble in reducing its emissions targets because of the way the power market's operating. They can't pass through the cost to retail prices, so it means that subsidies have to increase, which the government can't afford. Korea is probably one step ahead. It solved the problem in the wholesale market to enable the carbon cost to be reflected in dispatch decisions of power stations, which is a critical factor, but the retail side has not yet been solved. And then in the future, India will be facing the same challenges, Japan will be facing the same challenges, and all these other jurisdictions. So the critical issue is how, because the power sector is one of the most significant emitters in any emissions trading system, how the power station dispatch can be influenced by the carbon price to fuel switch away from coal towards lower carbon fuels and renewables. And then secondly, how the carbon cost can be passed through to the retail electricity prices. That's a critical factor because that's the one thing that enables the auction revenue to be scaled up. With the auction revenue scaled up, you can generate billions and billions of dollars of money. The EU has generated 140 billion euros. As we heard, Japan is looking at $135 billion. And then this money can be used to support investment in decarbonisation technology. So I think a very useful area that the Global Climate Alliance can work on is a technical subject around how the interaction of the power market can be properly aligned with carbon pricing to unlock the potential to generate huge amounts of revenue to support decarbonisation. And I guess this is a less politically sensitive topic, so it may be more amenable to bringing together Korea, China, Indonesia, India, Japan, EU as well, because they don't have so much problem, but they have some good solutions, Mexico, Brazil. So I think that's a really important area. And secondly is the carbon price itself. So I think every country is looking to use carbon pricing to achieve its NDC targets, but there are different ways in which the burden sharing is adjusted between ETS, non-ETS sectors, different mechanisms. So another very useful way is aligning methodologies and sharing best practice. So I think working groups and expert discussions and dialogue can be very beneficial. And I think there can be some very good ideas and some new thinking, as we just learned about from Japan, some very innovative ideas, and how countries can generate finance themselves to support their own transition.
So, thank you, Alistair. I see, Mr. Jay, and you wanted to come in. While you do, I would just wanted to reflect on, we are seeing in the last couple of years increasing tensions in the trade relations, and in particular, I mean, CBAM was mentioned here. It is obviously a very difficult issue, but the question would be, in this climate of somewhat growing rift, I would say, between different parties, how does the Global Climate Alliance propose to kind of overcome that I think growing climate, unfortunate and growing climate of mistrust? But wanted to come in as well. So
no, so I think it's very interesting that on this panel we have 3 people from the global north, if you will, and 3 people from the global south. And I think all of us in the global south will say that, you know, what's being inflicted on us right now is highly inequitable already. And then you bring in CBAM and say we will further, you know, make it difficult for you to trade with us. Becomes even more. It's like, you know, putting a wrong upon a wrong. And so there are real global equity issues in this. And that's why, rather than being in a mode of finger pointing, the idea of the Global Climate Alliance was to be very solution oriented. And the core of this Global Climate Alliance solution that we are advocating from a Global South perspective is really the idea of market making. The core of the Global Climate Alliance is market making. And let's talk about 3 different types of market making activities that we can do through the Global Climate Alliance. Let's start first and foremost with currency. How do you create a market for long-term currency swaps and price that? Because that will bring down the cost of capital for the Global South. So currency swaps, today, if you want to create a collar for a 15-year swap on a Nigerian $1 billion investment, you can't do that. How do we create a market for that and enable that to happen? Number 2, let's create a market for carbon credit. So we have different countries that are creating their own domestic carbon markets, but we all know from basic economics, it's suboptimal. Let Korea and Japan create their domestic market, but they could be investing in Nigeria or Brazil at a far lower carbon price. That's where their Japanese yen should be going. It shouldn't necessarily be going into carbon credits in Japan. So let's clear the global carbon markets, not just the domestic carbon markets. That's another very important market making activity that we can facilitate through the right institutional arrangements. And the third one, and I want to draw everyone's attention to what has just happened in Sikkim. Just a few weeks ago, we had a huge glacial lake burst. It swept away 15,000 crores, about $2.5 billion worth of dams that had been constructed on the Teesta River. 60% of that was owned by the government of Sikkim. 40% of it was owned by Greenco, which of course is funded by Temasek as well. 15,000 crores, $2.5 billion worth of hydropower facilities gone in a flash. When is the insurance recovery on that? God knows. How much is that going to set back Sikkim, which is going to get some 1,500 crores in hydropower revenues from that? when are they going to recover for that? It may take them decades to recover from that. Now, who's making the market for those kinds of extreme climate risks? There's no one. Whom do we go? Do we have the reinsurance capacity in India to absorb a 15,000 crore hit like that? No. So why can't we make a global market for that kind of cat risk that we have to bear? That market for Nigeria, for Brazil, for Indonesia, for India doesn't exist right now. But if we can create these market making mechanisms, whether it's for carbon markets, whether it's for climate insurance, whether it's for currency swaps, we can actually make it much easier for the global north to invest in the global south, because their currencies swaps are protected, their climate insurance is protected, because they can get high carbon pricing for it, and that will facilitate markets to work much better. And therefore, exactly as Mr. Ozenbajo was saying, we can then mobilize hundreds of trillions of dollars of private sector capital, as opposed to being reliant on just $1 trillion or $2 trillion of MDB capital. So the MDBs have a role to play, but it is only a catalytic role, a market making role, a global climate alliance type role, because then we can open the doors to private sector capital from the global north to come in. And I'll conclude by saying the following. This is for the benefit of the global north. It's for your grandchildren, Pedro. Similarly, Alistair, because it's your capital that will have secured returns, and it's your companies whose technologies will be used and have jobs for people in the global north. So it's a tremendous win-win-win. It's a win for the north, returns and jobs. It's a win for the south because it means investment and growth. And obviously it's a win for the planet. So why can't we structure these kinds of innovative institutional arrangements where we can make the market to deal with some of these risks and bring down the cost of capital for everybody?
Thank you. Thank you for quite an inspiring intervention. Jesse, you wanted to, I'll give you the last, the benefit of the last word, and then we'll go to questions. Jesse.
Better be a brief word then. On the win-win-win, you mentioned revenues from carbon markets. I think we've learned a lot. When we had our very first carbon market auctions in Europe, we failed to ring-fence those revenues. We've learned. We've also moved a lot of the revenues to the European common level. They are now funding an innovation fund. I think the next step is to look at how we use some of those revenues beyond just national borders. So throw that question out there without any direct license from any EU negotiator. Second tiny point, which is that you mentioned tensions in the world, and we can all have a long conversation about those. One underlying effect is there seems to be a lot less going on in the track 2 context between countries than there used to be on many, many topics, with the big exception of climate, where we're all desperately talking to one another. If we can get some of these wins right, I think it will help us much more broadly to keep the multilateralism process going, even as we rethink its design. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And again, drawing on my experience as negotiator in the UNFCCC, it has somehow withstood so much criticism over the years, but it still remains as a kind of a glimmer of hope for multilateralism. With this, let me turn over to the audience. And oh God, I have already three hands. Let's start with the ladies first over there. I don't know whether, is there a roving mic? We have a mic there. There we go. Somebody to the rescue. We'll get to you afterwards. First, you, sir, if you have the mic.
Myself, Amardeep Darade. I'm a CEO and founder of Panchatattva Fusion Private Limited. We are into ethanol, green hydrogen production, and SAF. So my question is to Honorable Jayan sir. Sir, I've been a keen follower of your policies and policy perspectives, and you have helped Government of India in driving major initiatives, such as in climate, also in aviation sector and several other sectors in funding and finance. So my question is, sir, what measures India can take to mitigate CBAM? This is my first question.
I think you'll only have one question because we have
Yes.
a number of other people. But no, you have please sit down. You have a very good question, which is how do we in India deal with CBAM? And I think that's where we need to have the collaboration with the European Union, which we've been trying to do. I myself have been involved in a number of discussions. And the sectoral decarbonization pathways become very important. If we can come up with a mechanism where we say that European steel companies have to be on one decarbonization pathway, which is perhaps much faster, but as long as India can be on a decarbonization pathway, which is not set to 2050, but 2070, for example, and that's good enough to avoid CBAM, then that's fine. So we need differentiated decarbonization pathways, one that's set for 2050, which is very rapid, and then another one which is more gradual that's set for 2070. But for that, we need to have the negotiations and the agreements and the collaborations.
Thank you, and I do hope that the CBAM proposal, well, not the proposal because it's now law in Europe, can in fact take into account such let's say dynamic relations with preferential trade partners. Now to you, this I think, yep, there's a mic coming to you.
So my question is to Jayant sir and Ms. Alistair. So you talked about starting with investments and cost-effective dealing with climate risks and stuff. So we already know about, when talking about like sustainability and balancing profits, it's difficult because our companies are already working on innovations, and it is a big business project, of course, to work with innovations and put investments into it. So how policy can assure that we have good balance of profits and sustainability? So I want you to talk about a little bit how business literally plays with the behavioral consumption of consumers, like so I hope my question is clear.
I think, can you repeat the question? Couldn't hear it so well.
I want them to talk about a little bit how policy can assure the balance between business profits and sustainability, but and give me the perspective how this behavioral changes in consumption of consumer that is affected by profit for business.
So how can policy affect the balance between sustainability concerns and profits at the corporate level, and I think also the influence of the behavioral change at the consumer level versus
right, like for an example, we know that how the mobile sector, the technology sector works, that they really like put into one technology there for consumers, and then literally develop it in some time and just take the last one away from the market so that their profits can increase.
Right.
And this affects the sustainability and climate in the other sense. So how we can balance it through policies?
So Alistair, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so yeah, how climate policy can balance those issues. So I think the first most important thing is how climate policy can be cost effective, how each country has its own NDC and wants to achieve that in a way that enables its industry to survive and compete internationally without any disadvantage. So this is exactly where the emissions trading system that India will be implementing enables the cost-effective compliance. So industrial companies can choose which is the best technology to invest in, the cheapest way to reduce their emissions, and if it's too expensive, they can buy allowances from the market. So they have a benefit, but also the carbon leakage mitigation is a critical factor. So every jurisdiction is looking to protect industrial competitiveness through ensuring that the best performers do not get disadvantaged. So there's various mechanisms to enable that through free allocation, through CBAM as well. Other jurisdictions are developing CBAM. And in terms of consumers, I think it's very important to see the trend that's happening now towards the beneficial role of carbon pricing to support social justice and to support disadvantaged communities and to provide finance to support those who are perhaps most disadvantaged stakeholders to higher energy prices. And if you look at the developments in the US, in Washington State, in New York, California, there's a very big focus on social acceptance of climate policy. And a lot of the revenue is going to support local communities. So I think it's trying to find a win-win solution, trying to find a solution that doesn't cause negative impacts to vulnerable stakeholders, doesn't provide negative impacts for best performing companies, but provides a very clear incentive for the worst performing companies to transform their fuel mix, their technology, and ultimately, I think everybody can see that there's great business opportunities in having low carbon. And when we talk about CBAM, this is not just the EU, but the US, Australia, multiple jurisdictions are thinking in the same way. So I think it's important that policymakers properly consider all of the critical issues and engage well with industry and key stakeholders.
Thank you. And now finally, your last question, I think. And it has to be brief, I would say.
Thank you. And hi, good afternoon. I'm Rahul Banerjee. And I actually couldn't have had a better panel than this to ask my question. So Jesse, you mentioned about an India-Europe partnership for development in the global south. And actually, I got to make the German Chancellor's calls during his February visit where we shared an idea of something similar, an India-Europe partnership and India-German partnership in the global south, especially focused on developmental aspirations in Africa. How do you see that happening in the coming years, especially in the energy sector? Thank you.
Jesse.
Well, I think we see a lot happening today. None of it's perfect. So we're learning from everything we attempt. I would like to see, first and foremost, a deeper basis of mutual knowledge. And that's really where I'm coming from on saying I think there is less dialogue going on other than in the climate space. I'm aware, for instance, that a number of senior European people thinking on this have not been to India in recent years, and that's not just COVID, it's important invitations, it's return visits. Okay, what are we doing that's working in the world? Well, I think there will be a session on just transition later, and that will talk about just energy transition plans, but let's not go there. Finance, yes. I think the problem description is now very clear. That's the first stage. Then, as earlier, we need to break this down into a number of sector-specific needs, into a number of different sources of finance. And personally, I think most about the public finance area. And that's really where, again, the carbon market revenues, I think, offer a lot of possibilities. Let me link the question of revenues to a comment about the CBAM. And that comment is, this is now a law in Europe. But European laws are also perpetual re-examination, improvement, renegotiation processes. No sooner was the law agreed than we all sat down and started talking about its revision. So please, I would very much like to see that conversation be a much stronger multilateral conversation. That could certainly start with Europe-India.
Thank you. And as a also European individual citizen, I certainly would vouch for that last wish of a more multilateral discussion when we come to the revision of the CBAM. As I mentioned at the beginning, 40 minutes would never do justice to the breadth of content that was proposed for this discussion. So I hope that it was enjoyable and that you've learned. I certainly have. Please join me in a round of applause to the panel. Thank you.